Welcome to Missing Chronicles, where we delve into the heartbreaking and enigmatic mysteries surrounding disappearances. Here, we will immerse ourselves in the world of unsolved cases, thrilling search efforts, and intricate journeys. The goal of this channel is to spread awareness, foster community connections, and provide support to the families and loved ones of the missing. Join me as we embark on a suspenseful journey, hoping to uncover the truth behind these missing chronicles. Help us sustain and grow Missing Chronicles by becoming a patron on Patreon. Your contribution ensures that we can continue our investigations, share compelling stories, and work towards a world where no one is forgotten. Join us in making a lasting impact today. Unearthly Enigmas, the bizarre mysteries of Shenandoah National Park, when something happens that either cannot be explained or that the proper authorities have a hard time solving, it lets us, whether we're armchair detectives, suburban housewives, or any other random person, speculate and add our opinions, theories, and ideas into the investigation. This sometimes makes us feel like we possibly could be helping to solve the enigma. When it comes to unsolved murders in particular, regular people, meaning not law enforcement or usual authority who would be investigating such things, feel like we are a part of the solution, but also in a way a part of bringing not only justice to our community but some form of closure to a family. There are also those of us who don't like unsolved mysteries simply due to the extreme anxiety the not knowing seems to cause. Whatever your interest in such things may be, I think you'll find this string of unsolved murders in our national parks interesting, heartbreaking, nonsensical, but also terrifying. Isn't there enough going on in our national parks today? Possibly having a serial killer in the midst of the places where we go to spend quality time off-grid with our family, loved ones, Girl and Boy Scout troops, etc., is especially terrifying. Most of the time, graffiti, vandalizing, and perhaps even trash dumping are the worst of the crimes you'll expect to see on public lands. It's extremely rare not to have crime, but to have violent crime in a national forest or park, or even just your run-of-the-mill remote woodland area or forest, it's unnerving and even somewhat creepy to know that while hiking a random trail for the day, there could be a human being stalking and hunting you along that same path. According to the FBI, you have a 1 in a million chance of being assaulted in a national park. Your chances of being assaulted just randomly walking down the street is 3,100 times more. While the authorities who investigate such unlikely crimes urge us to use common sense and caution, sometimes you or a loved one end up being that 1 person in a million. Regardless of how careful, learned, or smart you may be, let's explore and examine the information and facts of the crimes being committed in Shenandoah National Park, and see what kind of conclusions we can arrive at while we sit back, praying and hoping that the authorities get to the bottom of this soon. First up, we have Julianne Marie Williams and Laura Lolly Winans. The investigation into the unsolved murders of Julianne Marie Williams and Laura Lolly Winans in 1996 is still active to this day in 2023. While at one point the authorities did think they had the man who committed these horrible crimes, they had to let him go, and thus the rumor and speculation started as to what could have and might have possibly happened to these 2 innocent young women. Let's take a look at the facts of this case. Both women were in their 20s and from New England, and were planning on spending Memorial Day weekend in the Shenandoah National Park. They arrived on May 19 and were just looking for a fun and relaxing time enjoying the outdoors and everything nature had to offer. They camped in a very secluded spot facing the eastern part of Stony Man Mountain. 9 days after first arriving at the park, on May 28, the 2 women were reported missing when they both failed to show up for work and hadn't called in. For days after they were officially reported missing, on June 1, the women were unfortunately found deceased at their campsite. They were both nude and had their wrists bound with duct tape and covering their mouths. Both women also had their throats cut but hadn't been assaulted. There was nothing missing from the camp except for Lolly's personal belongings such as her journal and her driver's license. Of course, when this case hit the media, there was massive attention and major focus on it. Hundreds of tips were called into the investigators, but not a single one managed to produce any leads. The case eventually went cold, though still being investigated when the random and stray lead would come in from time to time. A year later, in 1997, a man named Darrell David Rice was convicted of stalking and assaulting a woman bicycling on Skyline Drive in the Shenandoah National Park and was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The more federal officials looked into Darrell and his crimes, the more they were able to make connections of him being in the park at the exact same time as Lolly and Julianne. In fact, they were able to see and positively identify him using security cameras entering and leaving the park during the women's vacation. A fellow inmate who played in a prison band with Darrell Rice testified against him and told authorities that Darrell had confessed to actually killing both women in the park. He was indicted in 2002 for the murders of Julianne and Lolly. However, 2 years later, prosecutors were forced to drop all charges against him due to conflicting information and unstable evidence. There were holes in the prosecution's case. An example of why their case fell apart is a couple who were also camping in the park the night of the murders and the testimony they gave. The male witness who came forward said he had noticed a creepy man staring at him from across the clearing while he was relaxing in his campsite with his wife. When questioned if he could pick the man's photo out of a lineup, he did choose Darrell David Rice but went on to say he was only about 65 to 70% sure that this was the strange man he had seen. The man's wife also gave evidence which was considered a bit questionable when she said that not only had she heard screams throughout the campground on the night in question, but that she had also been able to astrally project out of her body and further explore the crime scene. Needless to say, this wasn't exactly considered scientific evidence, and even when it did come to the science of the matter, it seemed also to clear Darrell Rice rather than indict him. DNA found on the duct tape belonging to a male did not match Darrell's DNA. In the summer of 2016, the FBI decided to re-examine this case and try and get it solved once and for all. Darrell Rice was released from prison in 2007, and after being incarcerated 2 more times after this release on some nondescript parole violations, police in Durango, Colorado had to make a public appeal for calm when there was some talk on social media about Darrell Rice being spotted in the area. The news seemed to have hit the public very hard, scaring many of the locals who were either already familiar with the case or had just recently become familiar when the social media buzz had hit. The local police departments were getting call after call about the possibility that a maybe killer was in their midst. Back in Virginia, however, the case of the murders of Julianne and Lolly are an open investigation, even if they are cold. The anniversary of the crime always comes with a bittersweet renewed interest. It dredges up the fear of the case being unsolved and the heartbreak of what happened to these poor women and the effect it had on the community, not to mention their families, but also the hope that perhaps the right tip finally coming in and the case being solved once and for all. Anyone with any information about Williams and Winans' deaths should contact the FBI's Richmond office at 804-261-1044, or you can go to tips.fbi.gov. Next up, we have Scott Lilly. Being described as a Civil War enthusiast by friends and family, it should be no surprise that when 31-year-old Scott Lilly set out on a journey of exploration and self-discovery, he chose the trail named Stonewall, as in General Stonewall Jackson. This was in reference to the Confederate general. Scott was from South Bend, Louisiana, and decided to take this trip of finding a meaning to life in general, as well as his own, and set out to hike the Appalachian Trail from Maryland to Georgia. Unfortunately, however, his journey ended tragically in Amherst County, Virginia, in July of 2011. When he was climbing a landmark mountain in Nelson County known as the Priest, Scott made his last contact with family and friends. About a month later, in August of 2007, a group of hikers out for a weekend of fun and relaxation happened across his dead body. It was located in a shallow grave just off a trail near a place called Cow Camp Gap in the Mount Pleasant National Scenic Area of George Washington National Forest. None of his gear was anywhere near his body, including his shoes and backpack. A medical examiner ruled that Scott had died from asphyxia by suffocation. Because his death had occurred on public lands, it was being investigated by the FBI. They had determined that his death was, in fact, a homicide, and in the days following their initial investigation, they tried in vain to contact several other hikers who had been known to have been on the same trails around the time Scott had been murdered. These people went under the trail names Mr. Coffee, White Wolf, Papa Smuff, Combat Gizmo, and Space Cadet. All of this time later and no arrests have ever been made. Despite so much rumor and speculation, there has been no evidence in the case and therefore nothing to lead the FBI to any suspects. Poor women and the effect it had on the community, not to mention their families, but also the hope that perhaps the right tip finally coming in and the case being solved once and for all. Anyone with any information about Williams and Weenan's deaths should contact the FBI's Richmond office at 804-261-1044, or you can go to tips.fbi.gov. Next up, we have Scott Lilly. Being described as a Civil War enthusiast by friends and family, it should be no surprise that when 31-year-old Scott Lilly set out on a journey of exploration and self-discovery, he chose the trail named Stonewall, as in General Stonewall Jackson. This was in reference to the Confederate general. Scott was from South Bend, Louisiana, and decided to take this trip of finding a meaning to life in general, as well as his own, and set out to hike the Appalachian Trail from Maryland to Georgia. Unfortunately, however, his journey ended tragically in Amherst County, Virginia in July of 2011 when he was climbing a landmark mountain in Nelson County known as the Priest. Scott made his last contact with family and friends. About a month later, in August of 2007, a group of hikers out for a weekend of fun and relaxation happened to cross his dead body. It was located in a shallow grave just off a trail near a place called Cow Camp Gap in the Mount Pleasant National Scenic Area of George Washington National Forest. None of his gear was anywhere near his body, including his shoes and backpack. A medical examiner ruled that Scott had died from asphyxia by suffocation. Because his death had occurred on public lands, it was being investigated by the FBI. They had determined that his death was, in fact, a homicide, and in the days following their initial investigation, they tried in vain to contact several other hikers who had been known to have been on the same trails around the time Scott had been murdered. These people went under the trail names Mr. Coffee, White Wolf, Papa Smuff, Combat Gizmo, and Space Cadets. All of this time later and no arrests have ever been made. Despite so much rumor and speculation, there has been no evidence in the case and therefore nothing to lead the FBI to any suspects. Anyone with any information about Lilly's death should contact the FBI's Richmond office at 804-261-1044, or you can go to tips.fbi.gov. And last up, we have Heidi Childs and David Metzler. Heidi Childs and David Metzler had been together for 4 years in the fall semester of their sophomore year in college in 2009. On the evening of August 26, the couple drove out to Craig Creek Road to a recreation site in Jefferson National Forest called Caldwell Fields to talk and play guitar. The next morning, a man out walking his dog came across David's 1992 Toyota Camry and thought nothing of it at first, but then he proceeded to take a few steps closer when he thought he saw something lying on the ground outside of the vehicle. There he found Heidi's body on the outside and David still inside the car. Both had been shot with a rifle sometime between 8:30 and 10 p.m. the previous night. Montgomery County Sheriff reported the crimes were brutal and ugly when addressing the news media and the public for the first time very shortly after the bodies had been discovered. In 2012, after the case went completely cold despite a coalition of law enforcement working together on it and a $70,000 reward, authorities released new information to the public in hopes of generating some new leads. The first detail was that DNA evidence had been taken from the scene and was tested against some nearby residents who were kept anonymous due to the ongoing investigation. The second detail released at this time was that Heidi's purse, which included her cell phone and credit cards, had been stolen or taken from the scene. No arrests have been made still to this day in March of 2023. However, this is not a cold case. This is still a very active investigation, said Lieutenant Kenny Light. Montgomery County law enforcement officials request anyone with any information about the crime to contact them. They're looking for information on people or vehicles that may have been in the area that night. You're urged to contact Kenny Light at 540-382-6915 and use extension 44422. Thank you for watching Missing Chronicles. We have explored captivating stories and searched for answers behind the vanished. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated with our latest videos. Share these videos to spread the message and assist affected families and loved ones. If you have any information related to the cases we've discussed, please leave them in the comments section. Together, we can make a difference. See you in the next Missing Chronicles.